Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing our series on reading the journals of Ralph Waldo Emerson. We are up to Journal 18, which begins in 1827, specifically January 4th of 1827, and Emerson at this time is in Charleston, South Carolina, um, recuperating, I suppose, from ill health. And with that said, I'll go ahead and start with the first entry. January 4th, 1827. A new year has opened its bitter cold eye upon me, here where I sought warm weather. A new year has opened on me and found my best hopes set aside, my projects all suspended. A new year has found me perchance no more fit to live and no more fit to die than the last. But the eye of the mind has at least grown richer in its hoard of observations. It has detected some more of the darkling lines that connected past events to the present, and the present to the future, that run unheeded, uncommented, in a thousand mazes wherever society subsists, and are moral chords of men by which the deity is manifested to the vigilant, or more truly to the illuminated observer. It does not always, this gifted observation, it does not always presuppose a regulated soul. A man may be a shrewd judge of the finest shades of character, whose own conscience is contaminated with habitual guilt. But such a man is not blind to the discrepancy betwixt his morals and his mind. He perceives the discord and cannot perceive it without alarm, for he has an instinctive dread of the tendencies to harmony in the universe, which he has often observed, and which betoken some future violence to root out his disorder. If the string cannot be made to accord, it must be broken. It is just a thought which has lately presented to me, and which fell in entirely with my own notions of compensation, not yet fully unfolded, that it is beyond the compass of the most subtle policy, when once the consideration of principle has been set aside, to regulate affairs so as always to succeed, or, as in the instance on which the remark was grounded, so as to keep for a man the popularity for which his duty was abandoned. For the order of Providence in the world fights against such a man, and somewhere on his way, maugre all his forecast, and all his fetches, he will be unexpectedly circumvented and thrown out. Emerson speaks on notebooks. If an ingenious man lived long enough, he might learn to talk by system, in a manner out of all comparison, better than men now use. Suppose him to keep a book of commonplaces, and as his knowledge grew, to put down on the page of each the theories that occurred. It is clear that in process of time it would embrace all the ordinary subjects of human discourse. He wouldn't talk so well as those who have the natural talent. Nature has fetches which art cannot reach, bewitching felicities, affecting pauses that the mere practice of a moderate genius wouldn't attain. But something would doubtless be accomplished that would put to shame the cheap, extemporaneous draggle-tail dialogue that takes place in our evening companies, even among men of letters and ambition, from candlelight till the bell strikes 9 and breaks up the company. Men lose their temper in defending their taste. A man becomes sensible now and then of the existence of a kind of country gentlemen in the regions of genius, a sort of taciturn critics who have in them a solitary talent. It may be a love of eloquence, an image enshrined in their souls of eloquence so beautiful and so glorious that the successful orator, if he could open the doors of the mind and behold, would find his satisfaction change to admiration, and move all the springs of wonder, turn his summit of success into a starting post. Such a man seems to belong elsewhere. He is a column in the desert, such as R.M.G., which stands for, perhaps, Robert Marion Godine, an attractive Southerner, perhaps brother to John G.K. Godine, Emerson's chum. It says he studied medicine after leaving college. It is the rare fortune of those who are born in these times and this country to be born of the blessings of the world. There's a freemasonry among the dull by which they recognize and are sociable with the dull as surely as a correspondent tact in men of genius. Emerson speaks briefly on the flag. It is surprising what frivolous things excite our strongest emotion. An old rag of blue and red bunting, the national flag waving in the air of these outposts of society, makes all my patriotism glow again. Emerson speaks on iron. It was formerly said that he who has most iron will be master of all this gold. In our times, war has surrendered his supremacy to trade, but the experience of nations has shown that the manufacture of iron is an unerring index of the degree of civilization. The consequence is that the position of Solon is still emphatically true, though in a sense very wide of that which was in his mind, that he who has the most iron will have all the gold. In your charity, the merit is always commensurate with the sacrifice. Emerson writes a poem on St. Augustine. For 15 winter days I sailed upon the deep, and turned my back upon the northern lights and burning bare, and the cold orbs that hang by them in heaven, till star by star they sank into the sea. Full swelled the sail before the driving wind, till the stout pilot turned his prow to land, where appeared mid orange groves and citron blooms the little city of St. Augustine. Slow slid the vessel to the fragrant shore, loitering along Montezana's sunny waves, and under Anastasia's verdant isle. I saw St. Mark's grim bastion, piles of stone planting their deep foundations in the sea, and speaking to the eye 1,000 things of Spain, 1,000 heavy histories. Under these bleached walls of old renown our ship was moored, an hour of busy noise, and I was made a quiet citizen, pacing my chamber in a Spanish street. An exile's bread is salt, his heart is sad. Happy, he saith, the eye that never saw the smoke ascending from a stranger's fire. Yet much is here that can beguile the months of banishment to the pale travellers whom disease hath sent hither for genial air from northern homes. Oh, many a tragic story may be read, dim vestiges of a romantic past within the small peninsula of sand. Here is the old land of America, and in this sea-girt nook the infant steps, first footprints of that genius giant grown that daunts the nations with his power today. Inquisitive of such, I walk alone along the narrow streets, unpaved and old, among the dwellers and jealous doors and windows barred upon the public way. I explore the castle and the ruined monastery, unpeopled town, ruins of streets of stone, pillars upon the margin of the sea, with worn inscriptions oft explored in vain. Then with a keener scrutiny I mark the motley population. Hither come the forest families, timid and tame. Not now, as once with stained tomahawk, the restless red man left his council fire, or when, with Mexique art, he painted haughtily on canvas woven in his boundless woods, his simple symbols for his foes to read. Not such an one is yon poor vagabond, who in unclean and sloven apathy brings venison from the forest, silly trade. Alas, red men are few, red men are feeble, they are few and feeble and must pass away. And here the dark Minorcan, sad and separate, wrapped in his cloak, strolls the unsocial eye. By day basks idle in the sun, then seeks his food all night upon the waters, stilly plying his hook and line in all the moonlit bays. Here steals the sick man with uncertain gait, looks with a feeble spirit at things around, as if he sighing said, "What is it to me? I dwell afar, far from this cheerless fen. My wife, my children strain their eyes to me, and oh, in vain. Woe, woe is me! I feel in spite of hope these wishful eyes no more shall see New England's wood-crowned hills again." Heard the roaring on the beach long before we saw land, and the sea was full of green twigs and feathers. A quick narrator note here. I'm aware that a lot of people refer to the city in Florida as St. Augustine. In fact, that might be the accepted way of saying it although the person for whom the city is named is pronounced typically Saint Augustine. But as I've already said Saint Augustine several times and in the poem beforehand, I'm going to just say Saint Augustine, and we'll just stick with that just for continuity's sake. Anyway, back to the narration here. St. Augustine, January 16, 1827. The colonies observe the customs of the parent country, however ill they may be adapted to the new territory. The Dutch cut canals in Batavia because they cut canals in Holland, but the fierce sun of the East Indies stagnated the water and slew the Dutch. In like manner, the Spaniards and the Yankees dig cellars here because there are cellars in Madrid and Boston, but the water fills the cellars and makes them useless and the house unhealthy. Yet still they dig cellars. Why? Because there are cellars in Madrid and Boston. Over the gate of the fort is an inscription which, being in Spanish and in abbreviated character, I was unable to read. After many inquiries in town, I could not find an individual who ever read it, or knew anything about it. Mr. Gay, the public interpreter, took the card on which I had written what letters were not defaced on the inscription, and succeeded in deciphering the following record. And what follows is a lot of Spanish words, which run in English as Don Ferdinand VI, being King of Spain, and the Field Marshal Don Alonso Fernandez, Hirapedia, being governor and captain general of this place of St. Augustine of Florida, and of its province, this fort was finished in the year 1756. The works were directed by the captain engineer Don Pedro de Brozas y Guerrero. It is commonly said here that the fort is more than a century old. It seems there was an old one of much earlier date standing on the same site, which was the foundation of the present erection. There are two graveyards in St. Augustine, one of the Catholics, another of the Protestants. Of the latter, the whole fence is gone, having been purloined by these idle people for firewood. Of the former, the fence has been blown down by some gale, but not a stick or board has been removed, and they rot undisturbed. Such is the superstition of the thieves. I saw two Spaniards entering this enclosure, and observed that they took off their hats in reverence to what is holy ground. In the Protestant yard, among other specimens of the sepulchral muse, the following epitaph is written over the body of Mr. Happold, a native of Germany, Rest in this tomb, raised at thy children's cost, here sadly summoned what they had and lost. For kind and true, a treasure each alone, a father, brother, and a friend in one. O happy soul, if thou canst see from high thy large and orphan family. St. Augustine is the oldest town of Europeans in North America, 1564, full of ruins, chimneyless houses, lazy people, horse-keeping intolerably dear, and bad milk from swamp grass, because all the hay comes from the north. 40 miles from here is nevertheless the richest crop of grass growing untouched. Why? Because there is no scythe in St. Augustine, and if there were, no man would know how to use one. Emerson writes on determination of right. It occurs to me in reading the history of the Revolution of 1688 that where, as in that case, the providence of God and the progress of mankind imperiously demand the final success of a cause, the particular events on which it might be beforehand supposed the general result would hang are disastrous, and yet without affecting that general result. A determined bias is given to the mass, which is preserved amid all the lesser revolutions which it fulfills by the foreign attractions to which it is subjected in its average orbit. James gains the victories, but William gains the crown. It is the same with the American Revolution. What follows is a annotation from the editors, which I will read. In the expression of doubts in the latter part of the following entry, and perhaps in some allusions later, there seem to appear reflections of the writer's conversation with a new and notable friend, At St. Augustine he met Napoleon Achille Murat, eldest son of Joachim Murat, Napoleon's brilliant cavalry leader, to whom he gave his sister Caroline as wife, and made him king of Naples. But for the overthrow of his uncle, the emperor, and the tragic death of his father, Prince Achille Murat might have succeeded to that troublesome kingdom. Happily, he sought his fortunes in the New World and became an enthusiastic American. He had married a Virginian lady, a grandniece of Washington, and was a planter near Tallahassee. Emerson by chance met Murat, who was 2 years the elder, and the young men were drawn to one another. Murat, brave, frank, and friendly, had a very active mind, but was skeptical as to the religious dogmas. Emancipated from the Church of Rome, he was disgusted with the low forms of the Methodist and Baptist worship that he found in the new community. Emerson, of course, was much disturbed at the frank agnosticism of this admirable youth, and gave him his first ideas of the liberal and humane views of the chanting Unitarians. The result of their discussions appears in a letter from Murat, which will be given a little later, also in the references to Boston and the Unitarians in Murat's intelligent and enthusiastic letters on America and the Americans to a friend in Belgium, which were published in translation in a little book and so entitled after Murat's death in 1847. Emerson writes on dark hours, still living in St. Augustine. A child in a vessel thinks the shores remove when the ship leaves the shore. When the affections depart from God, God appears to depart from the soul. His image fades fast from his sanctuary, and when he ceases to be seen, he is thought to cease to be. There is a tremendous sympathy to which we were born, by which we do easily enter into the feelings of evil agents, of deep offenders in the hour of their temptation and their fall. We catch with intelligent ear the parley between the tempter and the tempted. We measure with sad alacrity the joys of guilt. This is a part of our condition, a part of our free agency, and necessary to us as moral probationers. Let us then, since it lies in our power, observe these graduations by which he that stands in his purity suffers himself to decline to his fall. What hinders me from doing my will? I am perplexing myself with scruples that never entered the minds of thousands of persons, fellow beings of mine who have lived and acted in similar circumstances. Why should I embarrass my existence, voluntarily give up this enjoyment of life, which is equivalent to so much life itself, because of certain ideas, certain imaginations, which occur to nobody else, or if they occur, are defied? Who calls on me to be the solitary servant, or the victim, rather, of what is called conscience, when all my neighbors are absolved from its authority? Conscience, virtue. To be sure, these are words of wonderful efficiency, but there have been men who have denied their foundation in the nature of man. Yet these are all the alpha and omega of the argument. These two words are all the obstacles that stand between me and my advantage. They seem to me of some account. I am accustomed to revere them. I honor men that honor them. Yet there are many prejudices which I well remember to have influenced my conduct when a child, which I now despise and ridicule. These, too, may be but superstition, and a few years hence I shall wonder that I could ever be so pusillanimous as to regard them. Besides, what am I in the general system of being but an iota, an unregarded speck? Why then suppose that my puny arm is chained to one or another action by all this apparatus of invisible agency, that all my solitudes are swarming with commissioned witnesses, that every word I utter is overheard, that every thought I entertain is observed, that every insignificant passage of my life is brought into judgment? Alas, I fear me there is something fabulous in this prodigious array of solemn images, with which divines and philosophers would bear me down, and persuade me that the health of this wide universe of moral beings, of an extent that affrights the imagination, and the omnipotence of God over all, are nearly concerned in this pitiful contingency of mine, whether I shall act, or whether I shall forbear. Why, this is the very folly of the dotard, who thinks when a passing hurricane darkens a few leagues around his hovel, that the consummation of the world is come, whilst half the globe, besides, is basking in sunshine. I am wiser than this. I better rate my just value in the world. I can fulfill my purposes without being affrighted by these disproportioned bugbears. And what is the amount of all that is called religion in the world? Who is he that has seen God of whom so much is known, or where is one that has risen from the dead? Satisfy me beyond the possibility of doubt of the certainty of all that is told me concerning the other world, and I will fulfill the conditions on which my salvation is suspended. The believer tells me he has an evidence, historical and internal, which makes the presumption so strong that it is almost a certainty that it rests on the highest of probabilities. Yes, but change that imperfect to perfect evidence, and I too will be a Christian. But now it must be admitted I am not certain that any of these things are true. The nature of God may be different from what is represented. I never beheld him. I do not know that he exists. This good which invites me now is visible and specific. I will at least embrace it this time by way of experiment, and if it is wrong, certainly God can in some manner signify his will in the future. Moreover, I will guard against any evil consequences resulting to others by the vigilance with which I conceal it. January 30th, 1827. But now comes the analysis of this shallow philosophy. He that was sinless before declines from his integrity. He says, I have sinned, but I live, I am in health. I shall not sin again, and how am I the worse? And no man shall know it. Vain, blind man, alas, the laws which he spurned, the laws of the moral universe, have taken hold on him, and assert their insulted supremacy. He thought himself too insignificant to provoke the animadversion of the Most High, and that he might sin unnoticed in the immensity of God's government. But God has not so poorly framed the economy of his administration. He devised no fallible police, no contingent compensations. He secured the execution of his everlasting laws by committing to every moral being the supervision of its own character, by making every moral being the unrelenting, inexorable punisher of its own delinquency. In the hour when he sinned, that hour his own fate avenged on him the majesty of the laws he had broken. Emerson speaks on Tallahassee. Tallahassee, a grotesque place selected 3 years since as a suitable spot for the capital of the territory, and since that day rapidly settled by public officers, land speculators, and desperadoes. Much club law and little other. What are called the ladies of the place are in number 8. Governor Duval is the button on which all things are hung. Prince Murat has married a Mrs. Gray, and has sat down in the new settlement. Tallahassee is 200 miles west of St. Augustine, and in the journey thither you sleep 3 nights under the pine trees. The land in its neighborhood is rich. Here is the township of Lafayette. I saw here a marble copy of Canova's bust of Queen Caroline of Naples, Murat's wife. It did not strike me as at all wonderful, though Canova's busts of the Bonapartes are said to be his finest works. Here follows an annotation by the editors, which I will read. In a letter written to his brother Charles, January 27th, Mr. Emerson said, quote, Whoso is in St. Augustine resembles what may also be seen at St. Augustine, the barnacles on a ledge of rocks which the tide has deserted. Move they cannot, very comfortable they surely are, but they can hear from afar the roaring of the waters and imagine the joy of the barnacles that are bathed thereby. The entertainments of the place are 2, billiards and the sea beach, but those who cloth abhors the billiards. Why, theirs is the sea beach. A small gray-coated gnat is wagoner to the Queen of Fairies, and we who walk on the beach are seers of prodigious events and prophets of noble natures. End quote. To William, Emerson wrote a day or two later, quote, The air and the sky of this ancient, fortified, dilapidated sandbank of a town are really delicious. I am very decidedly relieved from my stricture, which seems to hold its tenure from Boreas. It is a queer place. There are 11 or 1200 people, and these are invalids, public officers, and Spaniards, or rather Minorcans. What is done here? Nothing. I stroll on the sea beach and drive a green orange over the sand with a stick. Sometimes I sail in a boat, sometimes I sit in a chair. I read and write a little, molding sermons for an hour which may never arrive. For, though there may be preaching in the world to come, yet it will be hardly after the written fashion of this pragmatic world. See Letters of Great Length in Cabot's Memoir, Volume 1. The Minorcans are very much afraid of the Indians. All the old houses have very strong walls and doors, with apertures, through which a musket can be discharged. They are delighted to find that under the American flag the Indians are afraid of the whites. Some of them, however, do not like to venture far out of the town at this day. Quote, "But what are you afraid of? Don't you know that General Jackson conquered all the Indians?" End quote. "Yes, but General Jackson's no here now." "But his son is, for you know that Indians call Colonel Gaddon his son." But then the Indians for all that." I saw by the city gates 2 iron frames in the shape of a mummy with iron rings on the head. They were cases in which the Spanish governor had hung criminals upon a gibbet. There is a little iron loop on one side, by the breast, in which a loaf of bread and a vessel of water were contained. Thus provided, the wretch was hung up by suspending the ring over his head to a tree and left to starve to death. They were lately dug up full of bones. Emerson writes a list of peculiarities of the present age. 1. Instead of systematic pursuit of science, men cultivate the knowledge of anecdotes. 2. It is said to be the age of the first person singular. 3. The reform of the Reformation. 4. Transcendentalism. Metaphysics and ethics look inwards, and France produces Madame de Staël, England Wordsworth, America Samson Reed, as well as Germany Swedenborg. 5. The immense extent of the English language and influence. The English tongue is spreading over all North America except Mexico, over Demerara, etc., Jamaica, etc., Indostan, New Holland, and the Australian Islands. 6. The paper currency, joint stock companies. 7. The disposition among men of associating themselves to promote any purpose, millions of societies. Quote, "I have seen," said a preacher in Northampton, "a drunkard who acknowledged his fault, a profane man who confessed his profanity, a loose man who owned his licentiousness, etc. But I never saw an ungrateful man who owned his ingratitude. An ungrateful man, a monster in the universe." End quote. The argument for necessity can never be got the better of. It is like a goose which, fight it down as much as you will, always cackles a victory. It always turned on you as you retired, so of Berkeley's idealism. There is hope of one who has a vein of genius that he will be a friend to virtue, for there is between virtue and genius a natural and eternal affinity, and where one is found, the other may be looked for, as in South America a gold mine is said to indicate the vicinity of diamonds. The bodies of intemperate men are the tombs of immortal minds. St. Augustine, February 2nd, 1827. With a little thinking, passive almost amidst our sensations, and rounding our lives with a little sleep, we count off our days with a prodigal hand. The months depart, and soon I shall measure back my way to my own people. But I feel how scanty is the addition I have made to my knowledge or my virtue. Day by day I associate with men to whom my society yields no noticeable amount of advantage or pleasure. I have heard of heights of virtue and lives of philanthropy. I am cold and solitary, and lead a life comfortable to myself and useless to others. Yet I believe myself to be a moral agent of an indestructible nature, and designed to stand in sublime relations to God and to my fellow men, to contribute in my proper enjoyments to the general welfare. What then, young pilot, who by chart and compass pointest out to others the shoals they must shun and the heaven they must seek? Art not thyself a castaway? Will you say you have no call to more austere virtue than you daily exhibit? Have you computed the moral influences of this quiescence, this waking torpor of the soul, and found them adequate to what may in equity be demanded of you? Young pilot, you dare not say A. 16th of February, 1827. My weight is 141 pounds. It is not these speculations which are most abstruse that either deserve or receive the best reward from fame. The only dispensers of fame are the middle class of mankind, and they will not value the far-sought abstraction, no matter how inaccessible or sublime, more than the fowl on the dunghill regards the pearl. It came from the distant climes, it was got with toil, it was hoarded with care, yet having no suitableness to the wants of the finder, is less valued than the kernel of corn. But those writings which indicate valuable genius treat of common things. Those minds which God has formed for any powerful influence over men have never effeminately shrunk from intercourse with unnurtured minds. They scorn to be tender and squeamish. Human destiny is not nice. They have taken hold with manly hand on its vulgar wants, on poverty and riches, on pain of body and pain of mind, on the inconveniences of goodness, and the compensating hope. Most poor matters point to rich ends. Besides the advantage of being understood, it is a groundless fear that the author loses a jot of true dignity by this humility in the choice of topics. For the high and low points of human life are so nearly allied that no man of powerful sense ever found himself on any subject far removed from the sources of what is deeper in human thought. It is a near neighborhood, that of greatness of destiny and lowness of lot, that of mind and matter, that of man and God. It is like our natural existence. Though we be pygmies of a few feet, it is not a dungeon wall which confines us to the earth. There is nothing between us and the infinite universe, so our life, which had its beginning a few summers ago from a sorry succession of some dull material causes, walks with God on the other side through time and chance, through the fall of suns and systems, through the unbounded ages unhurt and immortal. 'Tis the rich treasure in earthen vessels. Such being the character of our life, such must also be the character of its descriptions. If a man carefully examine his thoughts, he will be surprised to find how much he lives in the future. His well-being is always ahead. Such a creature is probably immortal. The worthy father of the Catholic Church here, by whose conversation I was not a little scandalized, has lately been arrested for debt and imprisoned in St. Mark's. This exemplary divine on the evening of his arrest said to Mr. Crosby, quote, "If you can change $10 for me, I will pay you the 4 which I owe you." End quote. Crosby gave him 6, which the father put in his waistcoat pocket, and being presently questioned, stoutly denied that he had anything from him. But Crosby was the biggest and compelled him to restore the money. I went yesterday to the cathedral, full of great coarse toys, and heard this priest say mass, for his creditors have been indulgent and released him for the present. I met some Indians in the street selling venison. I asked the man where he lived. "Yonder." "Where?" "In the big swamp." He sold his haunch for 5 bits. The purchaser offered him 1 bit and a bill worth $half and counted on his fingers this 1 and this 4. "You lie," said the Indian, which I found was his only word for no. I gave him a half-bit for a pickaninny. Indian notions about the creation in 3 pairs and 3 boxes. Colonel Humphreys is Indian agent. To his brother Edward, February 1827. Much of what we learn into the highest purposes of life is caught in moments, and rather by a sublime instinct than by modes which can be explained in detail. I acquire when musing on my office and my hopes, notions which might savor of enthusiasm to an unprepared ear. If any unlucky Charles lied on these sentences and called them obscure, tell him with Pindar, quote, "It sounds to the intelligent." End quote. To his brother, 23rd of February, 1827. How is it with the ambitious youth, he of the sometime melancholy temperament, he that was called ardent, eloquent, irresistible scholar, he who loved greatness and defied fair women, he who adored virtue on the great scale but was squeamish at viewing it on a small one, he who had enthusiasm from nature, but it was almost all evaporated in the kneading, he whose taste would be correct were it more manly, and whose form would be good were it more stout, thyself. I am prone to mercy, and would draw your character to the life, so that your own eyes should acknowledge the fidelity of the portraiture. The memory is sharp when home is distant, and the dim congregation which my fancy nightly and daily visits always appear in costume, each in his virtues and vices. You are in the heyday of youth, when time is measured not by numbering days, but by the intervals of mentality, the flux and reflux of the soul. One day has a solemn complexion, the next is cheerful, the south wind makes a third poetic, and another is sicklied o'er with a pale cast of thought. But all are redolent of knowledge and joy. The river of life with you is yet in its mountain sources, bounding and spouting on its way, and has not settled down into the monotony of the deep and silent stream. Vouchsafe then to give your poor brother some of these sweet waters. Write, write. I have heard men say, heaven help their poor wits, that they would rather have 10 words viva voce from a man than volumes of letters to get at his opinion. I had rather converse with them by the interpreter. Politeness ruins conversation. You get nothing but the scum and surface of opinions when men are afraid of being unintelligible in their metaphysical distinctions, or that the subtlety and gravity of what they want to say will draw too largely on the extemporaneous attention of their company. Men's spoken notions are thus nothing but outlines, and for the most part uninviting outlines of a subject, and so general as to have no traits appropriate and peculiar to the individual. But when a man writes, he uncovers his soul, he divests himself of his manners and all physical imperfections, and it is the pure intellect that speaks. There can be no deception here. You get the measure of his soul. Instead of the old verse, "Speak that I may know thee," I write, "Speak that I may suspect thee, write that I may know thee." Take your pen, therefore, and give me the secret history of the sanctuary you call yourself. What new lights illuminate, what fragrant affections perfume it, what litanies are sung, what works are daily done in its industrious recesses, and to what God is it consecrated? And if you have any inclination to retort and play the La Bruyere on me, I defy you. It will give me extreme pleasure to see you miss the mark, and more if you hit. To Miss Emerson, February 1827. Pascal wrote to expose the contradictions existing in human nature, to show that it was vile and sublime, and to furnish an account of the extremes. Young also stated and discussed the paradox, but a competent account has not, in my judgment, been given. Every man of reflection has felt a contiguity between what was minute and what was magnificent, which was never stated in words. There is not a thing so poor and refuse in the world, but that has some aspects and connections which are grand. The chaff on the wind, the atoms swimming in the sewer, fill a place in the system of matter as essential as the sun in heaven. And how then can man be low? If on one side his feet are in the dust, on the other there is nothing between his head and the infinite heavens. Yea, yea, though I may fail to make it apparent in language, I feel that close by meanness is grandeur. In a beggar's weeds, in a servile office, the imagination starts out with a noble recoil, and in that moment whispers, "Ye are gods." Never so lowly, but we remember that we are tenants of infinite spaces and survivors of the sun and the stars. Power, said Pythagoras, is never far from necessity. a stern saying which is both analogy and exemplification to my homily. What set me forth on this odd declamation was the curious moral quality we call patriotism, which seems to flourish best like flowers in lowest grounds. Wise men perceive that the advantage of the whole is best consulted in consulting the real advantage of the particular, and do not therefore dissipate their affection or their force. But the dusty artisan who needs some consolation for the insignificant figure his sordid habits and feelings make in comparison with the great, and in comparison with his own conscience and conceptions, is fain to remember how large and honorable is the confederacy of which he is a member, and that, however low his lot, his resources are yet reckoned an integral part of the awful front which the nation presents to the world. Hence the unaffected, boisterous enthusiasm with which any spirited allusion to the idea of country is always received by a mixed assembly. But it is not only plebeian clay that is thus touched, the sciolists also. You say the sermon on prayer wanted unction and authority, and allusion to a venerable name. Let me suggest that the Son of God, if he listens from on high to the feeble efforts of his mortal ministers, may more approve the piety which finds the original foundation of his Father's law complete and competent, than that which adds awkwardness and abutments to the work of omniscience from the second dispensation. The true account I take to be this: men were so ignorant and besotted they could not see the perfection of morals. Jesus Christ was sent to remove the blindness from their minds. They are now able to see the majestic proportions and the sufficiency of the first law, and it needs no corroboration. St. Augustine, February 25th. I attended Mass in the Catholic Church. The Mass is in Latin and the sermon in English, and the audience, who are Spaniards, understand neither. The services may have been recently interrupted by the imprisonment of the clergyman, worthy father for debt in the castle of St. Mark's. The people call the place Botany Bay, and say that whenever presidents and bishops or presbyteries have danglers on their hands fit for no offices, they send them to Florida. When the woods are burned, 'tis said that they set the rivers in Florida on fire. Emerson speaks on the Bible. The Bible is an engine of education of the first power. It does more than all other books. It is an index everywhere of light. All over the world where that book is found and honored, there is light. Where it is not found, there is darkness. The Sabbath doth more for education than all books and schools and institutions beside united. It is 1/7 of the week. It is 1/7 of the year. It is 1/7 of life. The child that hath lived in the light of no other opportunity at 7 years has had 1 year of education. The man at 60 and 10 has had 10 years of religious education. It is a sound doctrine that faith is virtue. If God sent a revelation daily, none could plead the merit of faith. St. Augustine, February 27th. A fortnight since I attended a meeting of the Bible Society. The treasurer of this institution is marshal of the district, and by a somewhat unfortunate arrangement had appointed a special meeting of the society and a slave auction at the same time and place, on being in the government house, and the other in the adjoining yard. One ear therefore heard the glad tidings of joy, whilst the other was regaled with "Going, gentlemen, going!" And almost without changing our position, we might aid in sending the Scriptures into Africa, or bid for 4 children without the mother, who had been kidnapped therefrom. It was singular enough that at the annual meeting of this society, 1 week after, the business should have been interrupted by an unexpected quarrel of 2 gentlemen present, both, I believe, members of the society, who, with language not very appropriate to the occasion, collared each other, and were not without difficulty separated by the interference of some members. There is something wonderfully piquant in the manners of the place, theological or civil. A Mr. Jerry, a Methodist minister, preached here 2 Sundays ago, who confined himself in the afternoon to some pretty intelligible strictures upon the character of a president of the Bible Society who swears. the gentleman alluded to was present, and it really exceeded all power of face to be grave during the divine's very plain analysis of the motives which probably actuated the individual in seeking the office which he holds. It fairly beat the Coesque Catalina. March 1st. I found here a gentleman from North Carolina who gave me some accounts of the monstrous absurdities of the Methodists at their camp meetings in that state. He related an instance of several of these fanatics jumping about on all fours, imitating the barking of dogs, and surrounding a tree in which they pretended they had treed Jesus. St. Augustine, East Florida, March 11th, 1827. To believe too much is dangerous, because it is near the neighbor of unbelief. Pantheism leads to atheism. Here follows a poem. I am an exile from my home, heavily, and all alone I walk the long seashore, and find no joy. The trees, the bushes, talk to me, and the small fly that whispers in my ear. Ah me, I do not love the look of foreign men, and woe is me that I forsook my little home, my lamp, my book, to find across the foaming seas this cheerless fen. I care not that it should be said by lords and grooms that nature in my land is dead, and snows are scattered on her head, whilst here the fig and citron shed their fragrant blooms, and dulcimer mosquitoes in the woods hum their sly secrets in unwilling ears, which, like all gossip, leave a smart behind. March 25th, weighed 152 pounds. A letter to Miss Emerson, St. Augustine, March 1827. I fancy myself better lately, through the blessing of God and the use of this fine air. And if it please him that I shall wholly recover, I agree to the sentiment of your letter that I shall be a wiser and better man. He has seen but half the universe who never has been shown the house of pain. Pleasure and peace are but indifferent teachers of what is life to know. And though the mind touched with poetry must have a God, and the heart will reveal one, if history does not, yet the smooth man of taste and ease will be satisfied with a very indistinct and shadowy personification, mixing on every side with the unintelligent forms of nature. Some spirit too vague, if not too kind, to rebuke and punish his sin and pride. But the decay of his hopes, the manifested inefficacy of efforts into which he has pushed the pith and resources of all his nature, suffering and the grievous dependence on other men which suffering brings with it, these things startle the luxurious dreamer and alarm him with necessities never experienced before. These suggest the possibility of relations more intimate and more awful than friendship and love. They bring to light a system of feelings whose existence was not suspected before. They place him in a connection with God that furnishes a solution of the mystery of his being. Yet is the lesson of resignation hard to learn, and I believe is seldom taught the young. It is easier for the venerable saint whose warfare is accomplished and whose brows are crowned to sing his hymn whilst the faggots are lighted, than it is for a youth whose unmeasured powers and yet immature virtues have already suggested an unbounded confidence in himself, one for whom the soothsayer Hope, quote, has turned the iron leaves of fate's dark book to read high dooms, end quote. These, and such as these are, my dear aunt, the thoughts of every young man whose projects of life are menaced by disease. I have made the case extreme, you see, and instead of painting myself, have given you one better and brighter. But if you complain of long words and trite thoughts, I confess I am fair game. What follows is a poem titled Farewell to St. Augustine. There liest thou, little city of the deep, and always hearest the unceasing sound by day and night, in summer and in frost, the roar of waters on thy coral shore. But softening southward in thy gentle clime, even the rude sea relents to clemency, feels the kind ray of that benignant sun, and pours warm billows up the beach of shells. Farewell, and fair befall thee, gentle town. the prayer of those who thank thee for their life, the benison of those thy fragrant airs and simple hospitality hath blessed, be to thee ever as the rich perfume of a good name and pleasant memory. The following is an extract from a letter to William, Charleston, April 23, 1827. My dear brother, I arrived here yesterday after a direful passage of 9 days from St. Augustine. The ordinary one is 1 or 2 days. We were becalmed, tempest-tossed, and at last well-nigh starved. But the beloved brother bore it not only with equanimity, but pleasure, for my kind genius had sent me for my shipmate Achille Murat, the eldest son of the old King Joachim. He is now a planter at Tallahassee, and at this time on his way to visit his uncle, Joseph Bonaparte, at Bordentown. He is a philosopher, a scholar, a man of the world, very skeptical, but very candid, and an ardent lover of truth. I blessed my stars for my fine companion, and we talked incessantly. Much more of him when I shall see you. Charleston, April 6th, 1827. A new event is added to the quiet history of my life. I have connected myself by friendship to a man who, with as ardent love of truth as that which animates me, with mind surpassing mine in the variety of its research, and sharpened and strengthened to an energy for action, to which I have no pretension, by advantages of birth and practical connection with mankind beyond almost all men of the world, is yet that which I had ever supposed only a creature of the imagination, a consistent atheist, and a disbeliever in the existence and, of course, in the immortality of the soul. My faith in these points is strong, and I trust as I live indestructible. Meantime, I love and honor this intrepid doubter. His soul is noble, and his virtue, as the virtue of a Sadducee must always be, is sublime. To Miss Emerson, Charleston, April 10th, 1827. I fancy myself wiser for my excursion. To be sure, one need not stir from the chimney corner for that, but I rake the bright atoms fastened together by quitting the fireside and sallying out after them, than by waiting for them in the slow and uncertain communication of books. Besides, to sluggish natures and manners impolite, travelling is the best lesson. When the man is at home, his standing in society is well known and quietly taken, but when he is abroad, it is problematical and is dependent on the success of his manners. If he can assume that part of gentleman, he is acknowledged as such. There is much entertainment also in the business of ascertaining the degree and character of 100 casual acquaintances, and observing how far your preconceived notions tally with your experience of any companion, as he gradually discloses himself. For me, who like all men of a religious temper love to consider myself as a favored child of the divinity, who was unrolling the universe before me for my particular instruction, and with an exact reference to my exigences and state of preparation, is bringing into my neighborhood now one and now another man, agent or combination of agents, until by just degrees I am strengthened in each immortal fiber for the scenes of magnificent action which another world shall disclose for me. It is very pleasant to retire with these views into my shell, and salute the comers as they pass in procession with a very majestic indifference, much as I would behold so many ingenious puppets which another hand is guiding. Nevertheless, I shall not deny that there are some who take such a strong hold of my attention that I am fain to quit my stoic fur, and fairly go out of my circle and shake hands and converse with them. Now I know my kind aunt, with all her electrical imagination, will think I am talking of women. Alack a day! It surely is not so. Woe is me! With all the chivalry that is in my soul, backed by all the muse, I pass in cold selfishness from Maine to Florida, and tremble lest I be destined for a monk. No, I was speaking of men, and another time I will give you an account of one whom it was my good fortune to meet in East Florida, a man of splendid birth and proud advantages, but a humble disciple in the school of truth. I'm going to insert here a little bit of a narrator interruption. and say that the next few pages are filled with letters of people, one to Emerson from somebody else, a person whom he never met again. I believe it was Marat. And as I went through it beforehand, it didn't really add much to this journal. And then there's another one from Miss Emerson to to Mrs. Ripley, which also doesn't really help us with Emerson himself. So I'm skipping those two little letters and moving ahead to Charleston, South Carolina, April 17th, 1827, which is back to Emerson himself writing. Let the glory of the world go where it will, the mind has its own glory. What it doth endures. No man can serve many masters, and often the choice is not given you between greatness in the world and greatness of soul, which you will choose, but both advantages are not compatible. The night is fine, the stars shed down their severe influences upon me, and I feel a joy in my solitude that the merriment of vulgar society can never communicate. There is a pleasure in the thought that the particular tone of my mind at this moment may be new in the universe, that the emotions of this hour may be peculiar and unexampled in the whole eternity of moral being. I lead a new life. I occupy new ground in the world of spirits, untenanted before. I commence a career of thought and action which is expanding before me into a distant and dazzling infinity. Strange thoughts start up like angels in my way and beckon me onward. I doubt not I tread on the highway that leads to the divinity, and why shall I not be content with these thoughts, and this being which I have majesty to my nature, and forego the ambition to shine in the frivolous assemblies of men, where the genuine objects of my ambition are not revered or known? Yet my friend is at home in both these jarring empires, and whilst he taxes my powers in this philosophic speculations, can excel the coxcombs and that con amour in the fluency of nonsense. Nevertheless, I cannot but remember that God is in the heavens, God is here, and in the eye of my friend is dull and blind, and cannot perceive him. But what matter if this being be acknowledged or denied, if the faith cannot impose any more of the effective restraint on vice or in passion than morals unsupported by this foundation? Emerson speaks of Charleston. In Charleston, I like well the decoration of the churches with monuments. It no doubt has a powerful tendency to attach. The Negroes in Charleston have a new theory of the seasons, vis-a-vis that the number of people from the north bring the cold with them. What follows is a poem of sorts. When thy soul is filled with a just image, fear not thou, lest halting rhymes or unharmonious verse cripple the fair conception. Leave the heart alone to find its language. In all tongues it hath a sovereign instinct that doth teach an eloquence which rules can never give. In the high hour when destiny ordains that thou bear testimony to its dooms, that hour a guiding spirit shall impart the fervid utterance art could never find. Emerson comments on the word listen, which is in quotation marks. A poet represented as listening in pious silence, quote, to hear the mighty stream of tendency, end quote. There is much wisdom. Let me say there is much duty in this employment. Charleston, South Carolina, 1827. He must have droll fancies sometimes cross his quiet thoughts, who in my vagrant verse shall look to find a holiday from study or from toil, and consolation to his mortal care. Such idler will not be a man of name, but must be, and therein resemble me, a little liable to ridicule, because he cares a particle too much for the opinion of the fickle world, and notes how merit does not swim to place in the tides of this world, and feels the scandal oft of low salute to men of meaner mould, and yet has felt, albeit with scorn the while, a kind of justice in the seneschal, the uncivil fate that made his fortunes vile. I am frank, my friend, your eye has found a gypsy muse that reads your lineaments to tell the faithful fortunes of your life. Go to, I'll feed my humor to the full, and still expand the pleasant commentary, who loves my verse is one whose roving eye detects more beauty than his tongue will own in art and nature. Nay, his traitor tongue, sometimes consenting to the coxcomb's jest, derides the beauty which delights his soul. He is a man who, though he told it not, mourned in the hour of manhood, while he saw the rich imagination that had tinged each earthly thing with hues from paradise, forsake forever his instructed eye, bewailed its loss, and felt how dreary bought was wisdom as the price of happiness. Ah me, sometimes in heady wantonness, and sometimes when the dainty south wind blew its soft luxurious airs and called the clouds, mustering their hosts from all the sunny bays. Then when the piping wind and sounding sea and tossing boughs combined their cadences, the sweet and solemn melody they made enticed him oft in heady wantonness to scoff at knowledge, mock the forms of life, cast off his years, and be a boy again. Then has he left his books and vulgar cares, and sallied forth across the freshened fields, with all the heart of high-born cavalier, in quest of forest glades hid from the sun, and dim enchantments that therein abide. I had rather follow him than talk to him. Fast, fast he leaves the villages behind, as one who loathed them, yet he loathes them not, and snuffs the scents which on the dallying gale the woods send out as gentle harbingers, brought from their inmost glens to lure the step of the pleased pilgrim to their alleys green. I know the pleasures of this humor well, and please your reader I'll remember them. First, the glad sense of solitude, the sure, the absolute deliverance from the yoke of social forms that are as tedious oft as a fretful and romantic man. As a mosquito's song at summer eve, in the woods he is alone, and for the hollow chat of men that do not love and will not think, he has the unpretending company of birds and squirrels and the fine race of flowers. Editor's note here says these verses were carried on at home in U and dated August 16th. He forms his friendships with the flowers whose habits of whose hue may please him best, goes by the red and yellow populace, that with their vulgar beauty spot the plain, to find the honored orchis seldom seen, the low pyrola with a lilac smell, or the small cinquefoil, the wild strawberry's friend. He speculates with love on nature's forms, admires a calyx, much as Winckelmann the architecture of a Doric pile. Not more he doted on the line of frieze or triglyph, or on architrave, than doth this dreamer on the slender shaft with arms and stipules graced, that lifts in air the lily or the loose strife tapestried with leaves, enclosed below the faithful capsule to transmit its race, like from its like to another year of flowers, once more to be the food of tuneful bird, low stooping on swift wing, or busy bee, or the small nameless eaters that can find a country in a leaf. Alexandria, May 5th, 1827. My days run onward like the weaver's beam. They have no honor among men. They have no grandeur in the view of the invisible world. It is as if a net of meanness were drawn around aspiring men, through which their eyes are kept on mighty objects, but the subtle fence is forever interposed. Quote, they also serve who only stand and wait. But they must wait in a certain temper and in a certain equipment. They must wait as the knight on the van of the embattled line, standing in the stirrups, his spear in rest, his steed foaming, ready for the career with the speed of a whirlwind. Am I the accomplished cavalier? Emerson speaks on compensations. In the view of compensations, nothing is given. There is always a price. Purity is the price at which impurity may be sold. If I sell my cruelty, I shall become merciful of necessity. No man ever had pride but he suffered from it, or parted with it for meekness without feeling the advantage of the blessed change. The angels, see Psalm 91, the virtues are the angels. A letter to his brother Edward, May 8th. Glad of Dr. Channing as some amends for the dullness, I fear I can't say degeneracy of the pulpit in the whole country. If men abhorred nonsense as much as injury, a new race of iconoclasts would outrun the fury of the Knoxes in demolishing our pews and spires. I suppose whenever the average intellect of the clergy declines in the balance with the average intellect of the people, it must happen that the churches will be shut up and a new order of things begin. The hazard of such a revolution, who can tell? And yet I have hardly been to church this winter without feeling that the beam of the balance trembled already. I am consoled by the reflection that there is much in man that operates to postpone the convulsion, or to guide the ship in the event of a storm. A letter to Miss Emerson, Alexandria, D.C., May 15th. I am writing here in pleasant durance till the sun will let me go home. I am not sure I am a jot better or worse than when I left home, only in this, that I preached Sunday morning in Washington without any pain or inconvenience. I have not lost my courage or the possession of my thoughts. It seems to me lately that we have many capacities which we lack time and occasion to improve. If I read The Bride of Lammermoor, 1,000 imperfect suggestions arise in my mind, to which, could I give heed, I should be a novelist. When I chance to light on a verse of genuine poetry, it may be in a corner of a newspaper, a forcible sympathy awakens a legion of little goblins in the recess of the soul, and if I had leisure to attend to the fine tiny rabble, I should straightway become a poet. In my daydreams, I so often hunger and thirst to be a painter, besides all the spasmodic attachments I indulge to each of the sciences in each province of letters. They all in turn play the coquette with my imagination, and it may be I shall die at the last forlorn bachelor jilted of them all. But all which make these reveries noticeable is the indirect testimony they seem to bear to the most desirable attributes of human nature. If it have so many conatus, they are not in vain, but point to a duration ample enough for the entire satisfaction of them all. They suggest a just idea of the world to come, which has always been made repulsive to men's eyes from the inadequate representations of systems of religion, which looked at it only in one aspect, and that, I am forced to use a word in a limited sense it ought not to hear, a religious one. But I am satisfied the future world ought not so much to be regarded as the place of final moral reward, but as the after state of man, since it is probable that a moment of that infinity holds no more relation of reward to past than doth a moment of the present life, for every moment of this life involves a relation of reward. And in this regard it is assuredly more consistent with our most elevated, and therefore truest notions of God, that the education of man should there be carried on by furnishing space and excitement to the development of every faculty that can add accomplishment to the noble being. And though our poor tools of art, the colors, the palette, the chisel, rhyme, and the pipes and strings of sound, must yield to finer and more efficient means, yet it would be to neglect those tokens of intended intellectual progress disclosed in our nature, to doubt that scope would be afforded to the compassing of great ideal results, of which these tools are now the poor inadequate instruments. Alexandria, May 19th, 1827. Mr. Adams went out a swimming the other day into the Potomac, and went near to a boat which was coming down the river. Some rude blackguards were in it, who, not knowing the character of the swimmer, amused themselves with laughing at his bald head as it popped up and down in the water, and as they drew nearer, threatened to crack open his round pate if he came nigh them. The President of the United States was, I believe, compelled to waive the point of honor and seek a more retired bathing place. New York, June 2nd. I am sometimes fond when I am uncomfortable, because to retreat on our own affections is the best way to put a rampart between us and fortune. Here is a list. It says lions seen in Philadelphia. 1. Deaf and Dumb Asylum. 2. Academy of Arts. 3. Philosophical Society. 4. Sully's Painting Rooms. 5. West's Pictures. 6. Waterworks of Schuylkill. 7. Mrs. Royal. 8. Hall of the Declaration of Independence. 9. Market. Lions of New York. 1. Broadway and Battery. 2. City Hall. 3. Van Buren and Emmett. Here follows an editorial note. Mr. Emerson worked his way slowly homeward, cautiously heeding any remonstrances from his chest at too rapid changing of latitude. He had opportunities to preach and did so in St. Augustine, Charleston, Washington, Philadelphia, and New York. He reached the ancestral home in the third week in June and joined his mother at the manse, his grandfather's house, where they were for the first time the guests of Dr. Ripley. Invitations to supply the pulpit of his father's church in Boston came to him. The improvement due to the southern journey shows in the return of courage and energy which appears in his writings. Yet he still had uncomfortable warnings that he was, as he said, all clay, no iron. In a letter written to his brother William in the end of June, he wonders whether, after all, he must give up the ministry. For, he said, my lungs and their spiteful lobes sing sexton in sorrow whenever I only ask them to shout a sermon for me. He took a better room in Divinity Hall for the rest of the year. He was asked to preach in Northampton for several weeks in the early autumn. Concord, June, at the Old Manse, 1827. Here is a poem. Awed, I behold once more my old familiar haunts. Here the blue river, the same blue wonder that my infant eye admired, sage doubting whence the traveler came, whence brought his sunny bubbles ere he washed the fragrant flag roots in my father's fields, and where thereafter in the world he went. Look, here he is unaltered, save that now he hath broke his banks and flooded all the vales with his redundant waves. Here is the rock where yet a simple child I caught with bended pen my earliest fish, much triumphing, and those the fields over whose flowers I chased the butterfly, a blooming hunter of a fairy fine. And hark, where overhead the ancient crows held their sour conversations in the sky. These are the same, but I am not the same, but wiser than I was, and wise enough not to regret the changes, though they cost me many a sigh. Oh, call not nature dumb. These trees and stones are audible to me. These idle flowers that tremble in the wind, I understand their fairy syllables. And all their sad significance, this wind that rustles down the well-known forest road, it hath a sound more eloquent than speech. The stream, the trees, the grass, the sighing wind, all of them utter sounds of admonishment and grave parental love. They are not of our race, they seem to say, and yet have knowledge of our moral race, and somewhat of majestic sympathy, something of pity for the puny clay that holds and boasts the immeasurable mind. I feel as I were welcome to these trees after long months of wearying wandering, acknowledged by their hospitable boughs. They know me as their son, for side by side they were coeval with my ancestors, adorned with them my country's primitive times, and soon may give my dust their funeral shade. Here follows another poem called The Storm. Fast, fast across the savage sea my little bark is blown. Down in the ocean mournfully the stars sank one by one. Jesu Maria, pray for me, my hope is well nigh gone. And now the heavens which gleamed before were sealed with windy clouds, and I beheld the stars no more in shining crowds, but loud above the tempest tore the canvas and the shrouds. The following lines written at this time were appended as the last verse of the little poem Fame, written in 1824, given earlier in these extracts and printed in The Poems, Centenary Edition, Appendix, page 384. Go then, sad youth, and shine. Go sacrifice to fame. Put love, joy, health upon the shrine, and life to fan the flame. Thyself, poor dupe, for praises barter, and die to fame an honored martyr. To Miss Emerson, June 1827. Although I strive to keep my soul in a polite equilibrium, etc., I belong to the good sect of the Seekers, and conceive that the dissolution of the body will have a wonderful effect on the opinion of all creed-mongers. How the flimsy sophistries that have covered nations, unclean cobwebs that have reached their long dangling threads over the whole ages, issuing from the dark bowels of Athanasius and Calvin, will shrink to nothing at the sunburst of truth, and nobody will be more glad than Athanasius and Calvin. A glorious moment, and yet a young man does not wish it arrived. I do not think it will be dreadful to me, and yet wish to interpose 30 or 40 years of strong life between me and it. In my frigidest moments, when I put behind me the subtler evidences and set Christianity in the light of a piece of human history, much as Confucius or Solomon might regard it, I believe myself immortal. The beam of the balance trembles, to be sure, but settles always on the right side. For otherwise all things look so silly. The sun is silly, and the connection of beings and worlds such as mad nonsense. I say that in pure reason I believe my immortality because I have read and heard often that the doctrine hangs wholly on Christianity. This, to be sure, brings safety, but I think that I get bare life without. I have no pleasure in the curiosity that hence arises to be falsified at that undeceiving hour. I covet no surprises then. I am content, if I can, to know that what shall befall me. There's one consideration, however, one check without which I am persuaded the soul would leap in its dark womb, the body, at the approach of the future. I mean the fear of death itself, the instinctive melancholy which long-trained philosophy does not strip off. If it be really true, and we plotters are to be so grand and infinite, mere beams of glory, spirits, one would think the soul would be so enamored of the strong suggestion that it would run before it meets its fate. But it is sedate instead, or, as you would say, wallows in the mire of life. I hope you won't scold a letter which adds nothing, even by guess, to the mass of truth, but to me 'tis pleasant in idleness to hover on the verge of worlds we cannot enter, and explore the bearings of the piled mists I cannot penetrate. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Concord, June 29th, 1827. The man who bates no jot of courage when oppressed by fate, who, missing of his design, lays hold with the ready hand on the unexpected event, and turns it to his own account, and in the cruelest suffering has that generosity of perception, that he is sensible of a secret joy in the addition this event makes to his knowledge, that man is truly independent. He takes his revenge on fortune, is independent of time and chance. Fortune may rule his circumstances, but he overrules fortune. The stars cannot thwart with evil influences the progress of such a soul to grandeur. See Taylor's Holy Living, page 128, Philadelphia edition. I have seen a skillful experimenter lay a magnet among filings of steel, and the force of that subtle fluid, entering into each fragment, arranged them all in mathematical lines, and each metallic atom became in its turn a magnet communicating all the force it received of the lodestone. August 16th. There is a pleasure that has no alloy, in a hope so confident and steadfast that it pushes forward through good report and evil to the accomplishment of its end, that it acts as what is spiritual should act, with a scorn of material obstacles, with a divine contempt for all that men think will hinder and bring it to naught. And lo, instead of a heavy defeat, it springs elastic, and as 'twere refreshed from apparent discomfiture, neither contracting its sail nor bating one tittle of its joyful pride. When bystanders say, "Look, there is a lion in the way," it answers, "But I am a man, and mightier than lions." When they say, "Men counterwork," it replies, but I go in the strength of God." It is what is unseen in all actions that gives them their character. It is what is unseen that gives splendor in the view of wise men. To Miss Emerson, August 24th, 1827. When I attended church and the man in the pulpit was all clay and not of a tunable metal, I thought that if men could avoid that general language and general manner in which they strive to hide all that is peculiar, and would say only what is uppermost in their own minds, after their own individual manner, every man would be interesting. Every man is a new creation. can do something best, has some intellectual modes or forms, or a character, the general result of all such as no other agent in the universe has. If he would exhibit that, it must needs be engaging, a curious study to every inquisitive mind. But whatever properties a man of limited intellect feels to be peculiar, he studiously hides. He is ashamed or afraid of himself, and all his communications to men are unskilful plagiarisms from the common stock of thought and knowledge, and he is of course flat and tiresome. 'Tis an old and vulgar maxim, take care of the minutes, and the hours will take care of themselves. But like many old and vulgar things, 'tis better than gold of Ophir wisely used. The Emperor Napoleon is as much a proof of heaven and eternity as the life of St. Paul. He proves how impossible it is to satisfy the human soul, but he neglected, and the world neglects to draw the right inference from their failures. Emerson speaks on For a Sermon on Solitude. There is a story of a man who on his deathbed called to him his profligate son and left him large possessions, only exacting of him the promise to spend an hour every day alone. The son kept his word and became a wise and good man. Of Mr. Adams it was memorably said by President Kirkland, quote, "For 50 years he rose before the sun." End quote. Quote, "Whenever Agesilaus made an excursion, he lodged in the temples most renowned for sanctity, and whereas upon many occasions we do not choose that men should see what we are about, he was desirous to have the gods themselves inspectors and witnesses of his conduct." End quote. Plutarch. Emerson speaks on genius and domesticity. Aunt Mary used her thimble twice as a seal to once for her needle, and I have heard my mother remark that her own was too much worn ever to make the intended impression on wax that Aunt Mary's did. The alpine flower that grew in fearless beauty amid storm and cold under the awful shadow of the avalanche will wither and die in the sunny gardens of the plains. Northampton, October 1827. There prevailed anciently the opinion that the human mind was a portion of the divinity, separated for a time from the infinite mind, and when life was closed, reabsorbed into the soul of the world, or as it was represented by a lively image, death was but the breaking of a vial of water in the ocean. But this portion of the divine mind in childhood and youth they thought was yet pure as it came from God, and yet unattainted by the impurities of this world. There was much of truth in the beautiful theory. The following is a sonnet called Written in Sickness. I bear in youth the sad infirmities that used to undo the limb and eye of age. It has pleased heaven to break the dream of bliss that lit my onward path with bright presage, and my unserviceable limbs forego the sweet delights I found in the fields and farms, on windy hills, whose tops with morning glow, and lakes lone mirrors of Aurora's charms. Yet I think on them in the sleepless night, still breaks that morn, though dim, in memory's eye, and the clear soul doth the foul train defy, of pale disease that would her peace affright. Please God, I'll wrap me in my innocence, and bid each awful muse drive the damned harpies hence. Cambridge, No. 14, Divinity Hall, December 7th, 1827. Here's an editorial note. In December, he went on a visit, probably an invitation to preach, to Concord, New Hampshire. Hence the notification in the following entry to the possible future reader of his journal, for there he met Ellen Louisa Tucker and fell in love. She was the daughter of Mr. Beza Tucker, a Boston merchant who had lately died, and her mother had married Mr. W. A. Kent of Concord, New Hampshire. In parentheses it says, I ought to apprise the reader that I am a bachelor, and to the best of my belief have never been in love. Robinson Crusoe, when he was in any perplexity, was wont to retire to a part of his cave which he called his thinking corner. Devout men have found a stated spot so favorable to a habit of religious feeling that they have worn the solid rock of the oratory with their knees. I have found my ideas very refractory to the usual bylaws of association. In the graveyard, my muscles were twitched by some ludicrous recollections, and I am apt to be solemn at a ball. But whilst places are alike to me, I make great distinction between the states of mind. My days are made up of the irregular succession of a very few different tones of feeling. These are my feasts and fasts. Each has his harbinger, some subtle sign by which I know when to prepare for its coming. Among these some are my favorites, and some to me as the Eumenides. But one of them is the sweet asylum where my greatest happiness is laid in, which I keep in sight whenever disasters befall me, and which it is like the life of angels to live. What follows is a poem entitled Song. The cup of life is not so shallow that we have drained the best, that all the wine at once we swallow, and lees make all the rest. Maids of as soft a bloom shall marry as Hymen yet hath blessed, and fairer forms are in the quarry than Phidias released. To Miss Emerson, November 20th, 1827. It is difficult to speak with confidence of religious feeling. The mind recurs at once to history for authority. It finds the great multitude of the best men who have lived and left a name to be what the enthusiasts call cold and prudent Christians: Bacons, Locks, Butlers, Johnsons, Buckminsters. But the enthusiast admits or insists on the fact that the world is against him, and appeals confidently to the received language of religion in every age which has always expected the suffrage only of a minority. At the same time, he proudly cites a concurrent line of elect souls coming down from the beginning, who saw the light that was not vouchsafed to the world, and were not disobedient to the heavenly vision. The apostles, the early martyrs, the Ebionites, the tenants of Thebes, the Benedictines, the Waldenses, the Puritans, the Moravians, down to Pascal, Wesley, and Cowper, besides what has been done and suffered from kindred motives by unnumbered devotees in the mysterious East, out of the pale of Christianity, and many indications of the same spirit before its advent, as the Gymnosophists of India, and the Essenes of the Jews. All these bear witness to a principle of human nature ineradicable in the shifting influences and forms of society, firm in the flux of ages, that suggests the sanctions the crucifixion of the flesh before, the mighty image of God within the soul. Moreover, in our weariest, most philosophic hours, the heart compels us to respect even what we deem the extravagant issues of devotion. The proper emotion is wonder, the proper duty perhaps a diligent study of the phenomenal and of ourselves. But I think no good man will laugh at Wesley, and no wise man be secure of his own superiority. 'Tis always grateful to find men, the solidity of whose understanding is beyond dispute, giving themselves heartily to devotion. The piety of Newton is inestimable, and there is something awful in the gravity and apprehensive contrition of Johnson's closet. It gives a start to the secure spirit, like his who, heard the bell of the convent toll for a departing sinner's soul. Nevertheless, we are not to be bound by suggestions of sentiment which our reason not only does not sanction but also condemns. 'Twere to throw our pilot into the sea and compliment to the winds. And when the mystics tell me, as the mystics will not hesitate to do, that there is sin in every good work, until I have the assurance clear as the sun in heaven of a new connection of God with my soul, of a new birth, or what not, I shall give them no regard. I shall be content, while the laws of my nature remain the same, with the beggarly elements of justice and charity, self-condemned, I own at the lax discharge of my known duties, but not curious to add to my genuine grief horrors for imaginary and remedialist delinquencies. Does this reasoning seem to you unsafe? Is it not to be applied to all that we judge false doctrine, coming under whatever authority of names and age? Were it not a crime of which account would be demanded, and involving possibly hereafter many more than myself, if I should surrender to the casual and morbid exercise of the sentiment of a midnight hour the steady light of all my days, My most vigorous and approved thoughts barter the sun for the waning moon. 'Tis all idle talking. In the extreme it is plain enough, but the difficulty I contemplated consists in finding the proper mean, in discerning how much, for certainly something, is laudable, and how much extravagant in the theory of duty, in learning how much we lack of the love of God, and in adjusting life betwixt reason and feeling, such as it may be plausibly denied that 'tis worth while to get rich, or to make acquisitions in science. But shall a wise man refrain? December 17th, 1827. But now and then the lawless imagination flies out and asserts her habit. I revisit the verge of my intellectual domain, how the restless soul runs round the outmost orbit and builds her bold conclusion as a tower of observation from whence her eyes wander incessantly in the unfathomable abyss. I dimly scrutinize the vast constitution of being into which this present shall be absorbed, in which we shall look back, peradventure, to Christianity as to a rosary on which, in the morn of existence, we learn to count our prayers, and think it idle to pause in the train of mighty meditation, to remember, in our ancient pupillage, the rudiments of those stupendous moral energies we shall wield at that hour. But no thought, no perception of truth, however limited soever, can become insignificant. God communicates with the thoughts of men, and to whatever magnificence of nature and acquisition we may attain, the whole past will always be the instrument of future works. Connection between God and the soul. What is religion but this connection? Is not this the thought that always invests human nature, though in rags and filth, with sublimity, that wheresoever a man goeth, there goes an animal containing in his soul an image of the being by whom the universe subsists? The mind is his image and mirror. Is it not that, with whatever deprivations blotted and disguised, God makes the main idea therein, to which all others arrange themselves as threads of steel to a magnet, or as all the magnets of the world to the polar axis? Is not the mind in health just in proportion as that idea is clear? If that is obscured, is there not death in the mind? I use mind in its largest sense, for I see that the intellect may be vigorous, as in Laplace, and refuse to honor its maker. But I am confounded by the anomaly. These views seem to me to hold. I cannot understand the feelings of the atheist. I cannot believe atheism and genius to consist. And yet what motive for the pretense? Doesn't the heart say hallelujah amid its prayers for Bacon, Newton, and Locke, for Socrates and Cicero? If there were no lopsidedness, no disease in the soul, the idea of deity would be its exact and constant measure of its progression. When that was great, the mind was great. Its own glory would keep even pace with the glory it gave. Is not this unutterably beautiful and grand in this within life, this eternal Emmanuel, God within us? When this shall have been taught worthily to men, the wailing spirits of the prophets may bend from their spheres, for the principle of evil shall come to his end, and God shall be all in all. Authors or books mentioned or referred to in journals of 1827. The Bible, Pindar, Socrates, Cicero, Seneca, Epictetus, Plutarch, Lives, Athanasius, Philippe de Comines, Memoirs, Calvin, Bacon, Shakespeare, Jeremy Taylor, Holy Living and Dying, James Harrington, Apud Hume, Pascal, Locke, Newton, La Bruyere, Cowper, Young, Berkeley, Butler, Madame de Staël, Scott, Quentin Durward, Bride of Lammermoor, Rokeby, Buckminster, Channing, Sermons, Sampson Reed, Growth of the Mind. This is the end of Emerson's Journals number 18. In the following video, we will continue with Journal 19. Thank you for listening.